Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's Mocktails and Masterpieces. I'm thrilled to have a colleague of mine from the Indianapolis Chamber Orchestra tonight, one of the finest musicians I know and one of the kindest human beings. Principal clarinetist Eli Eban is with us. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you. Good to see you here.
It's so great to see you too. You're with us virtually from Chautauqua, New York. If this were a typical summer, you'd be in the midst of a very busy season with the Chautauqua Symphony and teaching. This is anything but a typical summer. Can you tell us how you're staying connected with your colleagues and students during the pandemic?
Well, the good part of virtual music making and teaching is that we can do it at all. I'm using Zoom a lot, and I'm continuing to teach my IU students over the summer because they're in isolation and cut off from what would have been normal summer playing activity for them. A couple of them are in Korea and one is in Taiwan, so I'm teaching at various time zones, kind of zooming around the world virtually. And here in Chautauqua, the institution have put together a wonderful platform of 4 weeks of teaching and lectures and activities, lecture demonstrations. I just did a Mozart class this morning with my colleague Richard Sherman, the principal flutist here, in lieu of what would have been a very full symphony season, a college-age symphony that exists alongside the Chautauqua Symphony Orchestra every summer, but not this summer. They are also scattered all over. So essentially a summer of zooming around.
We were chatting before we just came online. I had assumed that you were probably doing this for years, your affiliations with educational institutions and organizations around the world. And then you made the comment that not really, because you always prefer to be in these places in person, all of the master classes you've done around the world. And certainly this is a learning curve for all of us who have now had to transition to online music making and online educating. The list of accolades in your career, Eli, is truly extraordinary. I'm thinking about where to start this conversation tonight. We're going to revisit one of the finest performances that I've had during my tenure with the Chamber Orchestra, which was your performance of the Mozart Clarinet Concerto. We're going to play 2 excerpts from that tonight. I do want to encourage any of our listeners who are tuning in, as they always are encouraged, to bring us some questions, things that you'd like to ask Eli Eban. But in regard to your career, one of the things that certainly stands out is what is really a lifelong collaboration with one of the world's greatest orchestras, the Israel Philharmonic. Can you tell us about your many years associated with this great orchestra?
When I caught fire as a young budding clarinetist at age 12, the Israel Philharmonic was pretty much the only game in town in very small Israel at the time. And just the emotional impact and the power and the might of a full symphony orchestra playing this great music, I just felt it through my bones. And I'd hear school concerts, busing up from a small town outside Tel Aviv, the youth concerts, and went on to study with teachers who played in the Israel Philharmonic and great mentors, great musicians, who had a sense of mission about hopefully growing the next generation of young Israeli musicians. From there into the Israeli Army Band, they used to tack us as the band onto the Israel Philharmonic for Overture 1812, Tchaikovsky. But at that time, I also started to serve as a substitute clarinetist at age 19, alongside my teachers. Third clarinet and Mahler third with Bernstein comes to mind. And so at a very early stage, I was fortunate enough to be exposed to some of the greatest minds on the podium and on stage. Later, my dream was always to play in the Israel Philharmonic. And after a 2-year stint in the Jerusalem Symphony, which is the radio symphony, I auditioned and was accepted into the Israel Philharmonic, which, being one of the, I guess you would call it the European model, self-run orchestras, generated a large part of their income, of their revenue from subscribers. So the Israel Philharmonic did, and maybe still does have, the largest subscriber base of any major symphony in the world. What that meant for me as a young neophyte clarinetist was that if I were to play or listen to a concert series with the Israel Philharmonic, I had the option of hearing it 5 or 6 times. That orchestra had to repeat programs that many times to work their way through the subscribers. Here in the States, I believe it's normal to have 2 or 3 repetitions. I didn't find that at all a drawback. I think it just got me deeper into the music, and the Israel Philharmonic still works that hard, as do the London orchestras, Vienna, etc.
I think that's fascinating, particularly that as musicians, the opportunity to play a program more than once is a benefit because, and I imagine specifically as a young musician, probably coming into contact with this repertoire for the very first time, a Mahler third that you mentioned with Bernstein, the opportunity to do that 5 times would only allow you to grow that much closer to the piece in the same week that you've been working on it. So I'd imagine that the amount of repertoire with the world-class artists on many tours, of course, this really must have been an eye-opening experience to not only music making, but also to journeys around the world as well with these artists here. We're going to talk about the Mozart Concerto now, which is one of the great cornerstones in the repertoire for your instrument. As we were talking before we came online here, I really can't think of another instrument that's identified with a piece, in this way. Violin, piano, there are significant pieces that you could point to as saying, this is the greatest, or to have that argument. But this piece holds a very specific place for clarinetists. And you mentioned that you played this piece in concert 50, 60 times. Tell us a little bit about the Mozart Concerto, maybe some anecdotes, some early memories of the piece and how you've grown with it over these many decades.
Well, the Mozart Concerto and the Mozart Quintet were the first pieces that I heard ever come out of a clarinet when I was paying attention. So just a little bit of background about that. In the age of vinyl records and LPs, etc., from my youth, I lived on a compound, on a closed compound, which was a science institute, the Weizmann Institute near Tel Aviv. My father was the director of that institute, and it essentially was a bunch of scientists living in their apartments and working on their theoretical work while listening to classical music. This is before television came to Israel and before all the rest of the noise-making accoutrements that carry us through our modern lives. And I paid no attention to those records. My parents tried to get me to play violin or piano, I think, to round out my personality as a little gentleman, but I considered them too nerdy. And then one day I played clarinet, and it was the Mozart Clarinet Quintet. It was Benny Goodman with Charles Munch and the Boston Symphony, and the other side of that record was the Mozart Clarinet Quintet. And that's, those goosebumps have never gone away. Though Goodman was known primarily for being a jazz artist, he was classically trained, and his sound had a soul to it. And I think that's what got to me, the sound of the clarinet. So I went home and asked for a clarinet, and within a very short time decided that this is what I wanted my life's work to be. Whether or not it was the clarinet itself that gripped me or the power of the music or the Mozart it's hard to say, but I suspect it's an equal measure of both, at least.
It's a masterpiece. There's no question about it. So many of Mozart's compositions are. This is the excerpt that we're going to play is the second movement, the first of these excerpts. This is from the performance in November 2018. Eli, I'll let you set up the second movement specifically of this concerto. It's one of the most famous tunes Mozart wrote. It's just absolutely exquisite.
Mozart turned to the clarinet late in his life, as did Brahms. And I think, the writing has been described as being autumnal. There's a sense of wistful, sweet longing and regret about it. That appeals to me personally about the clarinet, I must say. The agility is nice and exciting, but this adagio in particular is a piece of sublime I don't know. Books have been written about it. I'll just say that the great Viennese conductor Joseph Krips, who I don't know, Matthew, if you ran into him at all in Buffalo, asked that this adagio be played at his graveside at his funeral. It's a transcendent piece. It's both simple and complex, and it's something I think otherworldly is the best description that I've heard of it.
It absolutely is. Before we cut to this performance from November 2018, just to encourage anybody who might have any questions for a brilliant principal clarinetist, Eli Eban, to please send them our way on our Facebook feed, and we'll talk with Eli after we come back. This is the second movement of Mozart's Clarinet Concerto. Just exquisite, Ellie, just absolutely beautiful. We've got some great dialogue going on our Facebook page here. One of your colleagues, one of our colleagues in the orchestra, Principal Bassoonist Caristoli, says, you could feel time stand still as we took in each note, each phrase played with such magnificent intention. I have the opportunity in my career, Ellie, to work with very fine soloists, and one of the things that I've always appreciated was the regiment that soloists will put themselves through in the first rehearsal, dress rehearsal, prior to the concert. Everybody's got a different routine of how they practice, but I found yours particularly fascinating. An artist, who has played this piece so many times at such a high level. Even an hour before the concert, you were going over a few phrases, a few ornamentations with your metronome. Can you talk to us a little bit about perhaps not just your practice regime, but how it complements your playing in a performance as you prepare for a performance?
I think that in that particular case, use of the metronome, it's just a tool, of course, but our bodies change, I think, as our nervous condition changes, as our nervous system adapts or tries to adapt to the concert, to the reality of the concert hall, in which there always is the unexpected. So our pulse rate changes, etc. All the physiological states that we associate with, frankly, being nervous. So the metronome is just a plus minus indicator, but it's kind of an anchor, even that close to the concert, to give me, in this case, a sense of tempo, which if our pulse races or if we're caffeinated, then so will our tempo change if we let it. So I just make sure to tap into ground zero for tempo before going on. And I think it helps. Mozart, by the way, wrote that the most important thing for him is tempo, is time. So, and tempo isn't, of course, again, a metronomic endeavor. It's a sense of pulse. So I just try to keep my pulse within that and not lose control.
It was evident to me, it was evident to all of us who had this pleasure of performing with you, that you have thought over every measure. I mean, every shape and color. And I'm just curious, because this is a piece that you've lived with so long, how has your perception of this piece perhaps changed in places as regards tempo or shades of contour and color? Have you really explored everything that you in every direction, or have you stayed relatively constant as you've grown older?
I think the spirit of inquiry and curiosity about a masterwork of art has stayed the same. What probably has changed is myself, experience, and the Mozart Concerto as the Mozart Clarinet Quintet, though Mozart was younger, relatively young in chronological terms, but it was towards the end of his life, and then certainly Brahms. So there's a mature aspect to their work that is, I think, something that comes more naturally to me now. So yes, I think the interpretation, I don't think the baseline has changed, but maybe I've found more about where I can be freer with it, where I have to be both flexible and confident by making sure about my fundamentals. And the deep inquiry into this piece led me in studying a lot about the Mozart style in general, and about period practices, and about all elements of the context around and before and after in which this work was written. It's very operatic in many ways. At the time of composing it, Mozart was busy with Clemenza di Tito and a little bit of, I believe, Figaro, etc., the late operas. The writing for clarinet in the operas, by the way, the clarinetist in the Imperial Viennese opera was the same clarinetist that premiered the concerto. So I think it's important to look at Mozart's intention there. So it's an ongoing, with a great work of art, one never reaches bottom. And I think what I'm trying to say is that I never took it for granted that I'd figured it all out.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that one of the great rewards that we have in the arts, is that we can live with these pieces for a lifetime and still discover new things within them, try new things, and the freedom that we have, because what's on paper doesn't make a sound until it's created by an orchestra or an artist or a singer. It is truly one of the glorious things. We're going to now turn our attention to the third movement. Ellie, I'll let you set this up, because I think the concerto comes to just a perfect ending.
Yes. Well, I think, first of all, I'd like to take this moment to thank you and to thank the colleagues. And thank you, Cara, who I sit next to in the orchestra, for a very sensitive accompaniment. The work is very chamber, though it is a concerto with orchestra, it's very chamber music-like. And you enabled me to play with the freedom and come down to the softest dynamics, and just, you were all there. And I thank you for that. That does not always happen. So moving on to the third movement, the section that I chose is a section that shows, I think, a lot of dialogue or trialogue between myself and you and the orchestra, and sections within the orchestra, and a lot of back and forth, to show that it's not all about the soloist, but it's about us, and with a certain amount of first among equals emerging from the orchestra, all that color. Mozart was a great colorist for wind instruments. And just to mention before we hear it, that Mozart wrote to his father words more or less to the following. I sat smoking a good pipe this afternoon, and in a very good humor, I completed the orchestra last movement of the concerto. So there's a lot of joy, and the sort of contemplative sadness, wistfulness of the adagio is over, and now let's romp.
Well said. This is Eli Eban, the Indianapolis Chamber Orchestra, the third movement of Mozart's Clarinet Concerto. We'll come back and answer some questions and wrap things up with Eli. Marvelous performance, Ellie. Thank you so much I'm so glad that we can revisit this. This again is one of the great memories that I have of sharing the stage with you and all of our colleagues in this performance. We did get a couple great questions. One of them I want to turn to. David Weinstein says, "Beautiful interpretation. How much freedom do you think Mozart intended performers to have in terms of embellishments and articulations, for example?"
There were rules and conventions at the time that we're talking about 18th century music, that were an evolution of the rules and conventions of ornamentation in the Baroque period, which were missing on the clarinet. So this is a reason I think that clarinetists should study some Bach and Handel, etc. But it's not a free-for-all. I think there are definite grammatical rules about that. I just talked about that a lot in our Mozart class in Chautauqua this morning about all the wind concerti, etc. So taste, Mozart, by the way, wrote a lot in his letters about taste being the most important thing. And it's hard to quantify taste, a good taste. But I think not overdoing it with the ornaments would be a pretty good marker. So the short answer is there's a certain amount of freedom of choice, but it's not just more is better necessarily.
Absolutely. Well stated, particularly because the classical era was a reaction to the Baroque era, that heavily ornate style that they were trying to move away from. And, that's where the real shades of artistry come in, the decisions that you make, the tasteful decisions about that. You had an amazing release here that we wanted to just, before we wrap things up, talk about a collaboration with the Alexander String Quartet. Tell us about this recording project, if you would, Ellie.
Alexander String Quartet and I have collaborated for close to 30 years. We started quite soon after I came back to the States to pursue my career here. And from the very beginning, there was a very special chemistry. My colleagues and I from the quartet like to feel that there's a true chamber music feeling to what we do. And I always dreamed of recording these pieces with them. And it took a long time to get us to sit down in one place with that project in mind. We're fortunate that we got it done just before the pandemic hit. But it's just a joy. It's like we don't need words. We just sit down and bounce phrases off each other and get on with the art of making chamber music. I feel very fortunate and very privileged to work with colleagues like that, and even more so to have this something concrete like the recording to put our thoughts down on CD in this case.
Well, the reviews have been ecstatic. One review here from Art Music Lounge, his clarinet playing, of course, referring to you, has multiple shades, colors. Even in his upper register, he makes clear distinctions between forte and piano playing. And in his lowest register, Wonder of Wonders, he gives us that delicious woody tone that was the glory of Goodman's playing, and numerous other glowing statements here about your playing, and of course in collaboration with the Alexander String Quartet. So I encourage everybody to check out these two masterpieces in the repertoire, the quintets of Mozart and Brahms. Ellie, I just want to thank you for allowing us to revisit this very meaningful performance from 2 years ago. I wish you continued health and happiness through the summer here, and I hope very soon that we're able to share a stage together. I know that we all miss each other in our orchestra, and we look forward to a brighter future. But thanks for spending a little bit of time with us tonight on the Mozart Clarinet Concerto.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I look forward to seeing you on stage in October. And thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Thanks, everyone.